you're listening to Send in the Experts with Georgina Durrant. This podcast is all about teaching and supporting children and young people with special educational needs and disabilities, SEND. My name is Georgina Durrant. I'm the host of this podcast brought to you by Twinkle SEND. As a former teacher in Senko myself, I wanted to create a platform to share some of the amazing things that my guests are doing to support learners with SEND. So whether you're listening on your commute, tuning in whilst walking your dog, or curled up on the sofa with a nice cup of coffee, thank you so much for joining us. In this episode, I'm really excited to be joined by Kim Griffin. Kim is an occupational therapist and founder of GriffinOT. She qualified as an occupational therapist in Australia in 2003, and since then she has worked with many children and their families, as well as teachers in Australia, Ireland and the UK. A core focus of her career has been helping children who have sensory processing differences and or motor skill challenges. This includes extensive experience supporting autistic children with developmental delays, dyspraxia, DCD and specific learning difficulties. I've seen Kim speak a few times and I've read her book, so I'm genuinely very excited to have her on here. I'm also, like I know a lot of you, our listeners, are really keen to know what occupational therapists do, as well as learning more about sensory processing differences. So hi, Kim, how are you?
Hello, Georgina. It's great to be here. I'm as excited as you are because I've also seen your books and listened to lots of your stuff. So it's very exciting to finally, I think this is the first time we've actually met in person as such, despite having lots of virtual
little
chats and stuff. Yeah.
No, it's great. It's lovely to see you properly. So let's jump right in. Can you explain what an OT is? Because occupational therapist, whenever you talk about it, it sounds like quite a confusing term. People think about like work, and when we're talking about kids, they're not at work. So what does an occupational therapist do? Yeah,
it does. And I get this question so frequently that there are days that I just pretend I'm a teacher because it's so easy to not have to go through that discussion at like 7:00 at a barbecue.
Yeah, and they're like, what do you do? You're like, oh yeah, I'm the teacher.
And everyone just goes, oh, okay then. And they move the conversation on. I think, as you rightly said, occupation is very much a misnomer for occupational therapy, but the term, I'll just give you a little bit of the history. It actually comes from the concept of occupying time. So actually doing things. And they found back in the war hospitals, so kind of in the 40s, that the people I suppose they were patients at that time, but the people that were occupied by craft and activity actually had better mental health and physical health outcomes.
Wow.
So occupational therapists were sort of the people that were providing that activity to occupy time. As also why we're often called basket weavers, because maybe not in education, but in health, we're always like the basket weavers here. And that's because historically we were the ones that turned up with craft. And the original OT training was all about craft. Like I struggled with it because I'm not very good at craft, but you literally got taught to weave. And I think so that's kind of the history. And if you think of occupation as in occupying your time, and I think using the term activity is probably an easier way. And we really focus on participation and independence with activity. So that could be anything you want to do. So for children, it's things like play. That is, I mean, and that's your area of expertise. Like I see you smiling there because play is such a critical part of being a child and of learning and development. And then it's things like dressing, like all those self-care skills. And then at school, it's the functional skills, like, just even being able to sit in your seat, to do your handwriting, to cut with scissors, to use your glue stick when the teacher says, can you glue this in? Or, to run around on the playground and climb on the equipment or catch.
It's everything, isn't it? It's literally encompasses everything that kids do then.
Yeah, it does. And I think like OTs are the only profession that really look at both cognition, mental health and physical. So our training essentially, like I remember in first year, like we had to do activity analysis of, I mean, it was always making a cup of tea was the first one, but like breaking down like, what are the cognitive steps? What are the motivational steps? What are the physical steps? And I mean, I can do that to ad nauseum, but also see it as the whole picture of the goal is to make a cup of tea, but these are the steps, and this might be where it could go wrong. And then my job would be to support helping that. So, and I've ended up working with children. So it's very much looking at breaking down things like handwriting or breaking down things like tying a shoelace or things like that.
Yeah. It's really, really interesting. So like day in, day out, like what do you do day to day? Or what does an occupational therapist do day in, day out? Like what do they, when they go into classrooms, or what are they actually doing?
You know what? It's so varied depending on where you work. So when I worked in social services, it was a lot more about equipment provision, so seating or bathing equipment. I also did adaptations to housing for kids with more physical disabilities.
Okay.
These days, I work much more in schools. So, and I personally prefer working in a much more inclusive way, whereby I would go in, I'll observe, I'll chat to the teacher, find out what the concerns are, and then come up with support strategies for those concerns, but really focused on teaching the teacher or the TA how they can use those strategies in the classroom, rather than necessarily just pulling the kid out, doing my thing and going, and
weaving it into the lesson and being a part of what they do with everybody. I suppose it can benefit everyone, can't it? Not just for one child.
There's certainly some strategies that can be used across the classroom, like some of the, I know we're going to talk about movement breaks and things like that, but there's certainly some things that actually, if they're part of the whole class, it means that they're used more effectively by everyone, really, and they sort of they can support other children.
And nicer for the child, I suppose, who's being supported, so they don't feel different. It's proper inclusion that way, isn't it? It's not as obvious that they're the one that's needing the support.
Yeah, 100%, particularly for those kids that have the awareness, because I have worked with kids that that don't want to use a wobble cushion or don't want to use a pencil grip because they don't want to look different. So there was actually a really nice piece of research done on I think it was ball chairs, which are essentially they're like a yoga ball but on a base, and I think they had wobble cushions and a few different seating things, and they actually gave the whole class access to whatever they want. The kids could choose.
Oh wow.
And I know quite often teachers will say like, oh, but if they've got it, if Johnny's got it, then the whole class will want it. And I mean, a piece of that is around managing, like, well, the expectations are Johnny needs this to learn. It supports his learning. You don't need that to support your learning. So that's why you don't have it. But this particular class, the kids could choose. And by the end of the sort of research stage, some were using just their normal chair because they didn't like any of the other options, and so they'd almost been able to choose for themselves what worked best for them.
That's really nice.
Yeah, it was just I thought it was a very inclusive way of kind of looking at that. But so day to day really varies. I do, if I just think of my schools, I will write the reports for their EHCPs and help with that goal setting. I'll work alongside the SENCO and the speech therapist. I had a meeting just yesterday looking at, how are we going to integrate the supports across the school? How are we going to make best use of the specialist provision space, and kind of looking at that. I do a little bit of work for the NHS at the moment, and that's more with under fives, and there's a lot of assessment there. So we're looking at autism diagnosis. We're running groups to support communication skills, and I do a lot of sort of nursery visits and that to do more observations for assessment data. But I think OT kind of it encompasses so much, and it really does depend where you work, kind of what an average day would look like. I also do things like these podcasts, and I write blogs, and I create training, and I deliver things. Yeah, like yesterday I was also recording a piece of training for some therapists. So like I do quite a lot, but that is also my just where my career has taken me. So not everybody would have their finger in as many pies, I suppose.
No, absolutely. So going back to like an OT then, so for children, what sort of children are you helping then in particular? So it's like a little bit about autistic children.
Yeah, I work with a lot of autistic children, but that is because that's kind of the area that I have fallen into, I suppose. There were a lot of those kids would be the kids that came in, and then I've worked in a couple of autistic assisted resource units, so the specialist provisions alongside schools. So I certainly have a lot of experience working with autistic children, but as a pediatric therapist, you might be working with kids with Down syndrome or other genetic disorders. You could be working with kids with CP, so cerebral palsy, in case. Sorry, I'll do my best to avoid acronyms.
Don't worry, if I spot any acronyms, I'll jump in and
just like get on top of it. But OTs would also work with children that might have toileting challenges, or often on paper we'd get referrals for behaviour. So it might be that the child's hitting, or it might be that the child can't sit still, and quite often that will link to there's always, behavior is communication, so there's always an underlying reason for it. So whether it's sensory or whether it's cognition and ability to join in. And the other area would be dyspraxia DCD. So is the child not joining in because they genuinely haven't understood what they're meant to be doing, and it's not that they're being difficult, but they genuinely don't understand. So it's hugely varied across that spectrum of SEND. And I know it's really tricky because I was trying to kind of come up with exact figures for sort of who needs OT help, but because the Department of Education doesn't actually, I'm hoping they will start doing this when they have this online national system they're talking about, but they don't actually quantify what kids have on their EHCP. So nobody goes through and quantifies 50% have got speech therapy in their EHCP or things like that. And there's no kind of national record of that. And I was trying to figure out through Amanda Kirby's got some great stuff she's done on kind of percentages of I hate the term disorders, but essentially we're coming from that medical model. So percentages of disorders that overlap. And it's quite huge, 90%, I think, potentially 90% of autistic kids have got sensory needs. So you'd expect they would sort of need some OT support. There's quite a strong link between specific language disorder and dyspraxia and things like that. So it is tricky to kind of put a figure on exactly the number of kids that need support, but the OT can help so many different areas that there is a big need within the SEND community, even if that's not being met by the number of therapists that are available.
Yeah, it's not something that I was going to ask, but I was just thinking when you're saying there's a lot of children that need support, are you finding that there's more children needing support after the pandemic as well? Or have you not noticed? I just wondered. Is it too soon to know?
To be absolutely honest, I think right at the moment, certainly from an assessment perspective and an EHCP kind of need, there is there's more than we've ever seen. But I question if that's because the kids sort of we missed a year of schooling. Yeah. So there's kids that would have been picked up during that year that weren't picked up, and now we're essentially dealing with 2 years worth of need in one year. Go. So I'm hoping that it evens itself out once we get back, because even things like EHCPs, you need to have 2 to 3 terms worth of data to show this is what we put in place. The child still has additional needs on top of this. Here's our evidence. So schools, it was very difficult to collect evidence in the pandemic. So schools have kind of lost a year of evidence collection.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, and I also think, and this is absolute personal opinion, but it comes from experience, I did find that that quite a few of the families with SEND also had potentially other vulnerable people within that family. So I found that they were less likely to send their kids back in when they were able to as well. I found that there was some that kind of kept they seemed more likely to keep their kids at home. So particularly for the younger kids that didn't go into nursery, that didn't have those sort of reception experiences, they then were thrown into year one with very little schooling experience. Yeah. And year one's hard. Year one is
jump, isn't it?
It's actually the education national curriculum targets are actually higher than developmental ability.
Oh my goodness.
Which I hate. But unfortunately it's the same. It's the same. The reception target is that you'll be writing sentences before you finish, which means you're expecting a 4-year-old to write a sentence. And then they're going into year one. So if those kids that missed those experiences, because handwriting, it's interesting, reading did okay in the I hate SATs, but reading did okay and handwriting was lower. And not by lot, by just like 7% or something.
Yeah.
And there was like outrage and the kind of whatever. But I think handwriting is like, reading's kind of something that's a bit more integrated into society. You know, you'd read before bed and it's easier, I think, for parents to fit that reading in, which probably explains, and I think it was easier for teachers to do ebooks and things like that, or even a lot of teachers sat and read their stories to their classes via Zoom. So it's easier to facilitate that. Whereas writing, I think, was just that bit harder for families to facilitate at home, particularly if both parents were still working and trying to be teacher. And, you know, most kids with SEN find writing harder anyway. So it's a battle. So, you know, you do pick your battles as parents.
Absolutely.
And, handwriting battle is probably not top of your priority.
No, not at all. Yeah. That's it. Yeah, that's really interesting, isn't it? I wonder as well if, because there's been, you know, the parents have had a lot more time with their children than they normally would because they'd normally be in school, if they've picked up on things a bit more as well. I wonder if there's some of that. There
definitely has been some sort of discourse around that, or even just having a bit more awareness of maybe how much their child is struggling with stuff, because they're getting, because parents don't get to go in and watch a normal class day. They don't. And unless they're teachers, or unless they're teaching assistants or potentially school governors, that they just don't get that opportunity to sit in and look at what a class does, what the expectations of the national curriculum. I don't think most parents are aware of the expectations in the national curriculum. And that's not their fault. That is just I'm not aware of so many things. I'm aware of them because I need to know about them because that's my job. But like, if I worked in a different field, I also would have no idea.
And when you ask your kids like what they've done at school, you just get I've had a good day.
Yeah.
So you're not going to find out exactly what's happening. I must admit, like, my children don't have special educational needs, but I did feel during the pandemic, like I suddenly was aware of exactly where they were up to. I loved being able to know, like, I know, and that it's really useful now when they come home from school and they said they found something hard. I'm like, well, you did find this bit hard. And like, oh, remember when we tried this? And I love that it's a teacher in me, but I love that I've had like a glimpse into what they find difficult and what they're good at and how I can support them better. And it definitely brings up things that you weren't aware of. You're like, oh yeah, we need to do a little bit more with that.
But even like, you know, I sit in some math lessons. Like, I'm quite strong at math, but I sit in some math lessons and I honestly don't understand what is going on in like year 3, year 4. But like, just the way they
teach it,
and the way, particularly like addition, how they break it down into like you take. I'm just like column addition. I sit in lessons and I'm like, what happened to column addition?
Bring column addition back. Can we just put it in that little put them on top of each other and just add them up? But no, it's more complex, isn't it? It's clever.
This is so hard. And again, I think parents through the pandemic probably got to see some of that. Even, you know, I was sitting in a reception class the other day and the child wanted to write the word eyes because they were doing faces, and she wrote IGHS. Because that's the sounds they're learning. And it is. And she was correct. Phonically, she was correct. And her teacher's like, well done you, like, perfect, because phonically it was 100% correct. But my brain, my non-teaching non-phonic brain is just going, that's so wrong, and we're going to have to, like, if that was my brain, I would get to like year 2 where they're like, oh, no. Eyes are spelled EYES. Be like,
I must admit that was something during the pandemic I struggled with, was when my children were writing things phonetically accurate and I was like, but it's wrong. Let's just get it right. It's like, I couldn't, it's hard. And I think it's just a different way of when I was taught to spell, it wasn't the same way, and it's hard to be accepting of something that, you know, is not right. But I get the process obviously works.
And it makes, but again, it's that glimpse in that you got through COVID that parents don't typically get. So like, I know that there, and this is all my sort of opinion and experiences, so I know that there's definitely research coming out showing that some of the wellbeing measures are down, and there are, I mean, I know that overall some of the academic performance is down, but I'm hoping in terms of the SEND and we won't know for another 2 years, but I am hoping in terms of the current loadings on kind of SEND needs that it's more of just we lost a year of evidence gathering and of kind of observation. So we're now having to double down essentially on that.
Yeah.
But
that does make sense. Yeah. So in terms of how you got into the role, because I imagine there'll be teachers listening, especially ones in special educational needs, who'll be thinking, "Oh, OT sounds like a good job." So how did you become an OT? What made you want to do it? What's your background and what do people do?
I mean, OT is a fantastic career because it's just so varied. Like it's not just children. There's like a whole host of OTs working with adults as well. Yeah. I fell into OT back in 1997. I went to a university discussion. I was tossing up whether to do social work or medicine. And at the time, there was no undergraduate medicine. So I did want to do medicine, but there was no undergraduate courses. So I had to do a course before I could then apply to go and do medicine. And I thought social work potentially because it was sort of related, psychology maybe. And then I went and I listened to the Judith Travan-Hawke, who was the head of the department. They were just setting up the course. So I was the first year in Townsville in my hometown, and just her enthusiasm and her description of OT. And one thing I knew I really wanted to do was travel. So she was like, once you've got your qualification, it's recognized across the world. And I was just like, sold. Literally. I was like, that's perfect, because it also meant that it would be a good one to go into medicine from if that was the path I took. And I also, for me, I wanted to do something that would lead to a job at the end. Like I wasn't looking to do, no offense to things like art degrees, but I wasn't looking to go to university and come out and not have a profession. So that's kind of how I got into OT. And then I started it. I had no idea what it was, like no idea, absolutely no idea. I mean, most of my cohort, a third of them were there because they didn't get into physio and they were just biding their time to get to physio. I mean, I think on the first week when they're like, does anyone know what an OT does? Like one hand went up and it was the mature age
We've no idea why we're here.
Yeah, like literally. And it was the mature age student who I think had OT because they'd had an illness. Like it was literally hardly any of us knew. I think that's different now. Like I think nowadays there's much more awareness, and a lot of the colleges ask that you've done maybe a week work experience or something like that. But
probably after nobody had put their hand up, they're like, okay, we need to get them to get some work experience so they know what they're doing. They know why they're here.
25 years ago though, so and then so that's kind of, and I went in straight from school, so and then I fell into pediatrics really because it was the first. Most peds OTs always wanted to be peds OTs, like that was their goal in life. I struggled to find work because I needed to stay geographically just because of my circumstances at the time. So I fell into a early intervention maternity leave cover actually post uni, and I think part of the reason a lot of people didn't apply was because it was only part-time and it was maternity cover. So it wasn't like a real, I suppose it was a good job. It was an amazing job, but a lot of people would be like wanting something permanent and full-time. So I then took the job at the hospital after that because I got offered that kind of whilst I was there. So it kind of, for me, it led to then another job in the same area, in the pediatric jobs at the hospital within the same health service. And then I came over to the UK. I locumed around and did different bits and pieces, but I did a couple of children's jobs. And then I realized from doing those bits of adult locuming that I didn't particularly enjoy working with adults and that I much preferred working with children. So I took a job then setting up an early intervention team in Dublin, which when I got there, they'd frozen the funding for the team and I was the only one they'd employed. So they put me, so I'd gone over, I'd completely relocated to work with children under 5, and I ended up in a community role where the average age of my kind of clients was 70, I think. So I did like
slightly different to what you were imagining.
I did nearly a year working with older adults, mostly. Like there were some younger ones, but just the area I was mostly older adults. And that really reinforced that I much prefer working in pediatrics. And then I came back to the UK and I worked a little bit of locuming again in social services and wheelchairs, but started working with another therapist who had a private practice. And from there, I've done quite a lot of private practice or contracting into schools. And I did my sensory integration training along the way. Started that 15 years ago, actually. I was chatting to someone yesterday who was doing something for me, and we were trying to figure out when we met, and it was about 15 years ago. And I've done more recently a bit of a focus on attachment because I started doing some work for the Post-Adoption Support Fund, which is funding that's available for families of adopted children to get services and support, so therapy support, not other services, therapy support. So that's kind of my career.
So can you tell us more about GriffinOT as well? Because that's your like online thing as well that you've set up. You do so much, Kim. I don't know how you have the time. When I write this down, it's like you do this and then you do this.
Yeah, to be honest, it's a gradual build up though. I think people kind of look at it and go, wow, but I look at it and go, that is like 6 years of like me slogging away on my weekends or me slogging away in school. You know, I've got a massive list to do in August because that's when I have a bit more time. I was saying to you earlier, like I've got stuff I want to get done because I know I've got time this month and a bit more free headspace. I set the online arm of GriffinOT up. It was 5.5 years ago now, and that actually came from working from my adoption support fund work because I was working with families who would never normally be able to afford private therapy. Yeah. And I was seeing a lot more around kind of what they weren't getting. Yeah. And also at the time, I know this sounds crazy now, but at the time there was no dedicated online training for a sensory. Wow. It was all in person, or there was a little bit of stuff coming online, but it was always people had just stuck a camera in the room when they were doing a face-to-face presentation. Right. So it was not, the quality was awful. Like if there was a tech error, the tech error was in the video. If it wasn't like it was great content, but just the delivery for online, it wasn't great for online. No. So I made the decision that this could be done much more cost effectively and also much more accessible for families and for schools. And that's what started my journey of putting information onto GriffinOT.com in sort of the terms of blogs and that. I did some free sensory training just as an introduction. And then I've got paid courses which go into more depth. So, but it very much started from wanting to, because the available courses at the time, although they've all come down now, they had gone, the face-to-face training had gone, some of it had gone from sort of £50 to £100 almost in the space of 6 months. And and it was typically in London or Birmingham. So I'm just so mindful that most teachers have got kids, not all of them, but you know, it's very hard for teachers to take time off. It's impossible to take time off during term time, usually. I mean, you kind of can, but like it's very hard for parents to travel for a course that's kind of 9 to 4 because you got to get your kids to school. You've got to pick your kids up from school. And it just, so it came very much from wanting to make the information more accessible.
Yeah. No, that's really good. And a lot of the families you're supporting as well, they need it to be more accessible because the children might need them more as well. So it's not as easy perhaps as putting them in an after school club for, you know what I mean? It's there's a bit more support that's needed. No, that's really cool. So if we have a look then, so one of the main areas that you support are children with sensory processing differences. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us a little bit more about sensory processing differences and what they are?
Okay, so I will start just by saying that sensory processing, I know it's used as a disorder. I use the term differences because it is not actually a medical it's not a medical diagnosis these days as much as people will use it in that term. It very much it is incredibly common within autism, but there are also some other diagnoses that you will get that differences in sensory processing. And when I'm talking about that, I'm not talking about a sensory impairment, so being blind or having a hearing impairment and a cochlear implant. I'm talking about particularly with most people would think about it in terms of what I would say is a reactivity level. So reaction to sensation. And the sensation could be from your 5 main senses, so taste, touch, smell, hearing or vision, but it could also be from your internal sensations, which are your vestibular or balance sense, proprioception, so your feedback from your muscles, and interoception, which is the feedback from your internal organs. If you don't know what those terms mean, I would suggest my free training covers them. Like there's 5-minute videos on each of them, and it explains them in a way that everybody always says is very helpful. And the reactivity refers to the intensity of the response. So if we're just talking about reactivity, so some children or adults might have a bigger response to a sensation in their nervous system. That's often called sensitivity. Others might have a slower response or reaction, and those kids tend not to notice that something's happened, or they need it to be more intense before they notice. And sometimes if they're not getting it very well, they'll seek out more. So an example maybe with touch sensitivity would be a child who doesn't like the messy play trays in a reception or nursery, and they don't like getting glue on their hand because they don't like the stickiness of it. Or you might have a child whose movement sense, their vestibular sense, is slower, so they're really slumped at their desk and they really find it hard to kind of get that postural stability to sit up. So that's kind of the reactivity side of it. But when OTs look at sensory processing differences, we also include dyspraxia within sensory processing because it came from sensory integration, which means, again, sensory processing, sensory integration, a lot of people would use interchangeably. Various camps would separate them very specifically, but that is far too
too deep enough.
Honestly, general teachers and parents that sort of trying to understand this just need to know that there's the reactivity differences, which might mean that there's sensitivity to sensations or there's slower responses, or that those differences do also include dyspraxia, which we'll talk a little bit more about.
And so you were saying it's not just because I think a lot of people just think about the sort of 5 main senses, don't they? They forget about like the internal bit. And I find that really interesting, like the interoception. Would like being hangry, like I get hangry when I'm like hungry and I get angry because I need some food. Is that sort of a relatable example of sort of how you're affected by sort of your internal stimuli?
Yeah, 100%. So interoception, it's a bit of a buzz term at the moment, but it really relates to any of those messages you're getting from inside. So that could be going to the toilet, that could be hungry. And hungry is essentially you have ignored that hunger response because your body will be telling you, I'm a little bit hungry.
And you're like, get some food.
It's this report. Go away. So you it, or like whatever you're doing, and then you're a bit more hungry, but you ignore it, and by the time you get hangry, your body's reached a point of just it's essentially imbalance. They call it homeostasis is the big word. So that kind of balance. But by the time you get to hangry, your nervous system has reached a point of imbalance that it can't focus properly anymore, and you're then really I wanted to say impulsive is not quite the right word, but like your patience is gone, and you just need and the piece for that is that you're hungry, and there's certain kids and adults, to be honest, that just don't notice those sensations. And it's also one that kind of in terms of behavior management in school, if you've got a child who is dysregulated because they're hungry, sending them to the timeout, or putting them on the yucky cloud, or doing any of those kind of behavioral things.
The yucky cloud.
It's sort of like a sad cloud. I don't know. There's so many different things I come across in school. It's not the yucky cloud. Sorry, it's some that have got like a rainbow and the sun a sad cloud. I don't know. They're used less and less because I know there's more of a focus on kind of positive behavior engagement. But it's kind of separate. And I think having that awareness of sensory differences and things like interoception just give that extra piece of information in terms of behavior management. Because if it's hungry, they need to eat. Like
that is their need. That's what you can't do anything about it. Telling them to sit still or whatever isn't going to work, is it?
It isn't going to work. And I think I know teachers, particularly in I see it more in special schools, but like they will have like a bag of rice crackers in the cupboard. And there's certain one school, like particularly through COVID, actually, they because they had to separate the kids out in the lunch hall, they moved the lunch break. So some of the kids were having lunch at like 11:30.
And some were having it really late as well. There was the other side of the spectrum, wasn't there? And I know that was a big effect,
But like the later one was okay because they'd had like their morning break, so they kind of had something to eat. But the kids that were having lunch at 11:30 then had this 3.5 hour gap before they went home. So I know one teacher who just put in another snack break because she's like, they're not making it through.
No. But I suppose it all links back to what you were saying about like the impact on behaviour and behaviour being like an unmet need, isn't it? Or like it can be an unmet need, and it's not just hunger, but other sort of. So could it be like, I don't know, their school uniform being scratchy if they're really sensitive to that? That could cause a behaviour that you're not understanding that it's linked to that, or like, I don't know, really busy displays or noises or things like that. Would they all impact on behaviour?
Yeah, 100%. Because if you Joanna Grace talks beautifully about particularly visual overload and also visual, what they call habituation, which is essentially our brain kind of knows where everything is when we walk into a room, and it tends to only notice something that's different. And sometimes it doesn't even notice things that are different because you just kind of the brain doesn't reprocess that information. Some kids reprocess that information every time they come in. So every time they come in, they're looking every bit.
I had no idea about that. That must be super like overstimulating to see every time you go into somewhere and everything be new.
And then the display boards and things like that, if your brain has difficulty filtering out and ignoring that information, it is constantly going to be attending to it. Like even, I have one little boy I've recently started working with who fidgets with stuff, and he's so impulsive. It doesn't matter. If you put it on the table, he will pick it up and he will start fidgeting it with it. And my solution to that is I have nothing on the table. Like, because that just stops him picking it up and becoming distracted. But I'm not, like, it doesn't matter how many times I say to him, leave it on the table. He doesn't have the kind of impulse control to do that. So there's a lot of different things that can be impacted by that sort of sensory processing and the brain's reactions to sensation. Like even things like some classrooms have got printers in them, which might actually link to another classroom. So it's not even that the printing is coming from the teacher. It's not like the teacher's like, I'm about to print something. It's just this printer goes off.
Random printing noise.
So that's like for some kids, that's like what's that? Like almost sends them into fight flight. And if they're sitting next to that all the time, and that's a trigger for them that they might not be able to verbalize, you'll potentially get that behavior of they're not joining in, or they're trying to get out of their seat all the time, or they're totally disengaged because they've gone into overload. So there's so much. It's
almost like you've got to be a detective, isn't it, to try and work out these things that could be causing behavior. Or
and it's not just sensory. Like there's so many other elements in there, but I think sensory is important to consider as part of your analysis, because it may be language processing, it may be attachment, it may be it may be something's going on at home, like just that general some kids are in really, really awful home situations. So, or even something like the death of a parent, like that there's things that happen that do impact. And sensory is one of those things that mean, I'm very biased, but I think needs to be sort of included in the.
Yeah. So for a teacher then, if they're listening and they're thinking, right, how can they support children with like sensory processing differences? What can they be doing like tomorrow? What can they start doing to make a difference?
So I think the first thing is just having that awareness. So kind of bringing that knowledge of the senses into your understanding of kind of how development happens and also what could be impacting that child's ability to engage. So just have it as one of your, could this be sensory?
Yes.
Is the first step, because actually once you start thinking about it, you'll really start to sort of notice potentially it could be, especially if it's always happening when the printer goes off, or if it's always happening. Some stuff's quite simple once you're looking for it to kind of pick up on. And if it is something in the environment, then some of that stuff's quite easy to change. So, the printer again, it may be that the child sits right at the front of the class where it's less of a distraction. Or if it's the wall displays, there is a piece around having the more distracting stuff at the back. I know some classrooms are fab and have got like lines of string across the ceiling and stuff hanging down, and for some kids that is highly overwhelming. So it's looking at how can we support that, maybe, and a lot of the time it is just dropping it back. So they're kind of the simpler things in terms of noise. If you notice that the child struggles with being touched, don't put them in the corridor side, put them on the side of the classroom that there's less kids walking around. Like, don't put them next to the pencil box, because the pencil box is going to have a lot of traffic.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah, managing it just slightly, just little changes can make a huge impact, couldn't they? You're going to be less jostling and less knocking into you. And or if you've got a kid that doesn't like being touched and a kid that's like got no body control, don't put them next to each other. No,
because
that doesn't sound like a good idea.
Disaster at all. It's going to be a disaster for that kid that doesn't like being touched. And then in terms of the more the interoception stuff, that does need to be taught for some kids, and it's just bringing that awareness to it. There's a beautiful interoception toolkit which was created by Emma Goodall, which is available on the South Australian government website. Because that's who she, I can give you the link for it.
Yeah, I do. That sounds good.
And it's a really simple curriculum that just goes through kind of, what's it like when you're hungry? What's it kind of, what are the things that
sort of like teaching it to kids so they're aware of what they're actually feeling.
It's a simple scheme of work. I mean, they call it a scheme of work in the UK that kids can go through. And it's free. So I quite like, mentioning that one because it's free. And I'm working on, I know a lot of schools use zones of regulation. There's great things about that program. There's less great things about sort of that linear piece. And I always worry when I hear kids be told to get back into the green zone without any support around it.
Yeah.
So some of those tools are helpful, but I think they need to be used alongside teacher training, TA training, and also kind of more specific teaching of the kids. And I'm working on, I do that myself in my schools, and I'm working on making that kind of curriculum or scheme of work more widely available. It's going to take me another year to get it together, but that's kind of my next project is getting that curriculum out. So it's teaching those kids more explicitly, and even you can bring that into literacy lessons. So many of our stories have got opportunities to just stop for that minute and go, how do you think that character's feeling? What do you...
when have you felt like that?
When have you felt like that? So it's there are opportunities, because I know teachers are totally overloaded. So adding another thing can sometimes feel quite overwhelming, but there are opportunities where you can pull it in just in lessons as they're naturally occurring, and using sometimes those in the moment, if a child's struggling in math, just going, I can see that you're, well, I wouldn't use the term dysregulated, but, I can see that your body is a bit frustrated at the moment. What can we do to calm your brain down to then let you help to think about your math work, or what can we do to help with that?
That links nicely into what I was going to ask about sensory movement breaks, I suppose, as well, doesn't it? So can you explain what a sensory movement break exactly is? It's self-explanatory, I suppose. But
yeah, it is. I mean, I think the easiest way to think about it is if you, as adults, we do expect kids to sit for long periods. And if you think of yourself as an adult, I think COVID's a perfect example of that. The number of Zoom calls you had to sit on, and by the end of, I know myself, within sort of half an hour, 40 minutes, I'm just like, I just need to move. And if you go for that move, if you go for that quick walk, or even I leave my tea in the kitchen, so I have to get up and go and if I want a refill, I've got to get up and go and get the teapot in the kitchen, because that just gives me a natural movement break. Yeah, and the movement just helps to essentially wake your brain back up and wake your body back up so you can focus. And it's can be really easily integrated into the class. I think it's helpful, two things. I think it's helpful to either do it as a whole class, so just everybody gets up. I know some teachers do a quick little wiggle and stretch. Some teachers use videos. I've got some 3-4 minute videos on my website. GoNoodle has got, if teachers aren't familiar with GoNoodle, most teachers are these days. I think
they are now, aren't they? Yeah,
they've got GoNoodle's got some fantastic stuff, and they've got stuff for kind of calming down as well and alerting. So some teachers I know use the calm stuff when the kids come in from break or in from lunch, because they're like, their thinking is very disorganized because they've been running around and they're excited and they've got to come back in. So yes, I think it's looking at where you can easily embed that into the day. And quite often I find it's helpful to do it, if you've done your lesson input before the kids have then got to do their independent work, have a quick little break, or between math and English, or kind of just at those natural transitions within the day, just add a little bit of movement in.
It's almost like thinking as an adult, at what point would I need a tea break?
Yeah,
because that is you say that is my sensory movement break myself. I'll do some work, I'll go on a call, do a bit of a podcast, and then I'll be like, all right, I'll go and make myself a cup of tea and go for a little wander around. And so it's like breaking the day up for that, isn't it? But not giving the kids tea.
It is. And it's the same, because even teachers in the classroom, typically they might be still for the input, but then during the independent work, they're walking around the classroom checking on everyone. So teachers are getting that natural
they're having a break.
But the kids are still expected to sit in the same place for that entire lesson.
That's a really good point as well.
So potentially as a teacher, you're not noticing kind of how still the kids are, because you've had that chance to get up and go and check on your 6 different tables. The other thing I more advocate for these days is sort of a movement space in the classroom that kids can go for just that quick little top up. So if you see that a child is kind of wiggling about and not focused, send them to, I call it the move it zone, because that just isn't easy.
Move it zone,
and just I tend to find it's important to have a couple of pictures there. So I've got my own cards, which will be ready to go in the next couple of weeks, actually. But I know Twinkle's got a load of movement break stuff as well. And it's just putting those, these are the 3 things you can do. Come up and do them in sequence. So it's got...
gives them a bit of structure, some ideas of what they can actually do when they're there, rather than they get to this move it zone and then they're like, now what?
Well, 100%. And also it helps with the behaviour management of it. Because the other thing I often see... and again, not a criticism, and a lot of this is because people haven't had training and they've been told that they've got to have a movement break for the kids, and they set it up, but then they kind of don't. I feel sometimes teachers don't feel like they've got permission. If the OT has said they've got to have this, they then don't feel like they've got the permission to behavior management if it's going wrong. But the thing is,
true.
If the kids aren't using the movement zone appropriately, and if they're not coming back to their desk more organized and ready to work, then it's not the right solution for them. And if you've got the kind of 2, 3, 4 activities there and a structured sequence, that also gives you the behavior management of, John, you're meant to be doing the movement zone. It says star jumps, warrior, and breathing. You're not doing that. You are either following the rules or you're sitting back down. It allows you to kind of set the expectations, which I find is sometimes not done as well as it could be for some of those bits and pieces.
Oh, that's so interesting. I think I could talk to you all day about sensory processing differences. I find it fascinating. I really do. If we chat about dyspraxia as well, because I know that's another area you said you support and OTs in general support. Can you explain what dyspraxia is? Because I feel, again, it's a term I think not everyone's aware of.
It is, or it's a term that kind of people will be like, oh, I'm a bit clumsy, you must be dyspraxic. It gets thrown around as much as dyslexia does. Like anyone who spells a word wrong is dyslexic. So dyspraxia, the term kind of comes very much from the sensory. In pediatrics, it comes very much from Ayres, who was the original researcher in sensory integration, from her work. And she used it to describe the difficulty children have when they can't. There's 3 components she would put in: coming up with an idea of what to do, actually planning how you do that idea, and then doing it. But the core component for dyspraxia is that planning, just planning how to do it. So, and dyspraxia, again, is also not a formal diagnosis. Developmental coordination disorder is the formal diagnosis, and a lot of people would use that term interchangeably now. So DCD, dyspraxia, kind of interchangeably. There's also a lot of work around that's showing that dyspraxia is not just about the movement difficulty, but there's executive function difficulties there as well. So things like time management and just general planning and organization of just space and things that are going on and general life is often difficulty. So, as those children become adults, things like budgeting and things like getting to appointments on time and even planning shopping so that they've got the right food, just all of those kind of grown-up planning things. But I've lost my train of thought there because I disappeared into adults. So it's very much that piece around, can the child plan what you've asked them to do? And kids with dyspraxia will really struggle with that. And once they've practiced it, they're fine. But it's that initial figuring it out is hard. And the other thing they're usually not very good at is generalizing. So if they've learned one thing, they won't necessarily take that to the next. So if you've done tennis in PE and then you start badminton, you'd expect most kids would be like, all right, it's a bat, there's a net, we're hitting back and forth.
Similar.
Like there's degrees of similarity there, whereas dyspraxic kids won't necessarily make that generalization. And you may need to actually go through and say, you've got to hold the bat. Remember, we did this in tennis. Hold it with this hand. You've got to aim for the shuttlecock. It's kind, and I think that's where kids with dyspraxia often get labeled as lazy or not interested or unmotivated, is because kind of people make the assumption that they could do last week's task. So that's kind of 80% of this week's task. Why aren't they just getting on with it? But actually for them, it's like, I'm back at 0%.
In the beginning. Gosh, that's so interesting. I had no idea about that side of it. For me, like you say, I knew about it's an awful word, but feeling like clumsy and that side of things I knew more about than that. Wow.
Yeah. Well, it used to be called clumsy child syndrome, I think.
Did it actually?
I think the original I think some of the original wording was clumsy child syndrome.
That's awful, isn't it?
Yeah. Oh man, like there are so many, like even when I started in the 90s, like there's been such a shift in terminology.
Goodness,
even in the last 10 years, I would say, but certainly if you go back and read stuff from 50 years ago, the terminology is outrageous for today's time.
Definitely. So in terms of supporting children with dyspraxia in your classroom, again, if we're thinking of practical ideas, if someone's listening thinking, oh gosh, so-and-so in my class does have dyspraxia, I've not really given it much thought, what should they be doing more to help them?
So I think the first thing is just that acknowledgement of, actually, we might be back at 0%, so I need to treat you like you've not come across this before. Giving a physical demonstration is quite helpful rather than just that verbal instruction. So, and I think that's important for once kids get into sort of key stage 2 in particular and key stage 3, because it is just, here's your instruction, get on with it.
So sort of modelling it and making them aware of what you've actually got to do and what it looks like rather than just
and sometimes talking that modeling out aloud as well. So like, I'm going to do this because that's what, just giving them the plan essentially. Particularly for writing some of the sentence starters or those, I never know what you guys call them, but that kind of outline, the outline documents where you've kind of got the first paragraph has to have this, or kind of those documents can be really helpful for kids to get their ideas sorted. Or mind mapping sometimes, particularly if the older kids can't organize their thinking, doing that mind mapping with them and teaching them how to then. So I would normally put the topic in the middle and then have 4 or 5 boxes and then have to have 3 or 4 ideas for each of them, and then teaching them how to turn that into a sentence.
That's the tricky bit as well, isn't it? Once you've got that, then actually getting it on. And these are, I suppose, are useful strategies not just for children, but for the children when they grow up as well, to be able to use when they're older, aren't they? Because when they're at work, they can use them. It's good to have these, like a toolkit themselves of strategies that they can use, because it's not going to go away.
No, and it is teaching that kind of components of planning. And the other thing is just give that bit more time. And sometimes I'll also get parents. It can be helpful for some kids to pre-teach. So like particularly like PE, for example, because usually schools have got like a annual plan and you kind of change every 6 months. You might do football first term, athletics next term. So sometimes it's handy to give parents the heads up on what's happening next term, so they can do a bit of practice at home. Do
that sort of prep right that early, sort of, this is how to hold a tennis racket. This is what
and just so that
beforehand, so they're getting them up to the same level as their peers, I suppose.
And just giving them a bit of an idea around it, rather than it just being this completely new thing.
No, that's brilliant. I like that. And so does dyspraxia affect sort of handwriting and that side of things?
It's really common. I would say it's very common for the handwriting to kind of be the referral reasoning to OT and things like that. So handwriting is quite a complex task, because you've got the motor component of it, but you also have the language component, and you also have then the organizational kind of structure component. So and some kids only have problems with the actual physical component. And if you ask them to tell you, and you can separate this out really quickly, because if they can tell you if they can literally talk for 10 minutes on the question and give you the answer verbally, but they can't write it down, their problem is more that motoric piece. But you have got some kids that can't give you the answer verbally either. So for them, it's kind of, it's a bigger challenge, and there will definitely be some language processing things in there as well as the motoric piece. So I think it's important to separate that out, because for the kids that have got problems with just the motoric piece, when they get older, voice dictation can be an absolute lifesaver for them these days. Whereas the kids that struggle just even with getting the composition there and answering or understanding and then answering the question, it kind of has to go back to more the language support first. And voice dictation and things like that may not make them any quicker.
It's really interesting, because handwriting, it's not just, copying out letters onto a sheet, is it? And getting the flow of the letters and getting your cursive writing good. It's a lot deeper than that, isn't it? There's a lot more going on.
And that's why you'll see kids, they can do that practice sheet beautifully, but then when you get them to actually write in their books, it doesn't cross over, because the amount of mental load to then compose work in a book and figure out the answer to the question, figure out the spelling, figure out the sentence structure, they've had to do so much thinking to get their letters right that they can do that in isolation. But when you then add all of those other components to it, the neatness of the letters just goes out of the brain, because they're focused on like spelling and getting a full stop in.
I'm not going to ask you all my questions, because we've talked a long time, but one thing I'm really interested in your opinion on is pen licenses, because that links to, I know your opinion on this, which is why I'm asking you, because I've actually read your blog on this. But so those that aren't aware, pen licenses are certificates which children can get to have permission to write in pen. Obviously, as someone who supports children with special educational needs and disabilities, I know what your opinion on this is going to be. But what are your views, Kim, on pen licenses?
I just find them really unhelpful, because most of my kids don't get them until the concessionary pen licenses are given out in either term 3 or term 3 here, term 4 in Australia. And it's so demotivating for those kids, because they're never going to have the neat handwriting that qualifies for a pen license. And what it also does is it disadvantages them when they then get into the next year, because the next year they have to write in pen. So they've had a lot less practice.
I hadn't thought of that side of it. Yeah, I just always saw it as something that seemed really unfair. Like, I just could see the children that wouldn't get their pen licenses, and it's like it's a bit ableist, really, isn't it? It's like you haven't. It
is very ableist.
You can't do this, so we're not going to give you the certificate. Yeah.
But it gives them less practice. Also, some kids actually find writing in pen easier because there's less friction on the paper. So the kids that have got the kids that get a really tired hand really quickly, they find pen easier because there's less friction on the paper if you've got more of the handwriting.
Yeah, like a sort of wet sort of pen that sort of flows better. It would be easier than scratching it out on a pencil.
And the other thing I find is that kids that make a lot of errors, they quickly just transition back to pencil themselves, because what they don't realize about pen is you can't rub it out and you can't correct it, you can't erase it. So they actually kind of almost self-select then, but it doesn't make them feel as bad because they've decided they want to write in pencil, which is different to not getting their pen license, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. So before we finish then, tell us just a bit about your books and all of that side of things. I do know about your books, but you've got 100 Ideas to Support Sensory Processing Differences, which was out in August last year, which was a similar time to mine, so I'm very aware of it. It's a really good book. And then your latest one, I'm not sure how much you're allowed to tell us about it, but I was very lucky to be able to see the first complete draft in January, so thank you for that.
I've got lots going on.
Make me stress thinking about it.
No. I mean, 100 Ideas is part of the Bloomsbury series, so they've got lots of 100 ideas. My topic is sensory processing, so it is exactly what it says in the title. There's 100 ideas in there for sensory processing in the classroom. I spend the first sort of 2 chapters laying the scene and sort of making definitions of different concepts, and then the rest of the book is support strategies you can use in the classroom. It's designed, you can just pick it up and read. Each idea is a standalone, so you don't have to read the whole thing in order. The next book I'm quite excited about. It's coming out with Jessica Kingsley, but I don't think it's due until March, so it's a little bit of a way off.
I'll wait for that. It's brilliant.
If you join my mailing list, I'll definitely send a broadcast out. Or if you join my socials, I'll definitely send a broadcast when it's out. It's called Success with Sensory Strategies or Sensory Supports, and it's very much a step-by-step guide of how you can use your assess plan, do review cycle within using sensory supports at school. So it lays that foundation. It gives you a way to kind of assess need, very simple, but a basic kind of assessment, goal setting, and then it's got the strategies at the end, which I know everyone just wants the strategies, but I always find if you understand the arousal and the reasons you're doing that, it makes so much more sense when you get to the strategies and you can use them more effectively. So that's the books. And then the website, there's lots of training on sensory processing on there. There's fine motor skills training, which is just a 2-hour course on development of fine motor skills, development of scissor skills, pencil skills. I'm adding in development of handwriting to that over the summer. So by September, October, the handwriting content will be in that. And I've also got it's pretty much ready to go, Write Rules, which is my handwriting program, which very much focuses on teaching handwriting in letter formation patterns using songs. So there's a different song. For each letter formation group. So there's start at the top, and there's no lifting, and there's starts like curly cur. So it's linked together, and like the kids love it. They just get up and they're doing their dances, and then you hear them writing, and they're singing the rules as they're writing. But it's a full scheme of work. So it's got warm-up fine motor activities, warm-up gross motor activities, and they're all videos that the teachers put on and the kids can copy. And it's got the pre-writing skills in there as well. But what I have deliberately done is linked the pre-writing skills to the letters that they relate to, because I find a lot of the existing pre-writing stuff is just kind of random groupings of formations and stuff, whereas I've very much linked them link them together. So there's lots of stuff. There's lots of stuff
for anyone who hasn't seen any of Kim's videos, they're absolutely brilliant. I know your Crocodile Snap song has nearly, I had to check this because this is a huge number, 350,000 views on YouTube. So if anyone wants to have a look at that one's brilliant, isn't it? It's so good.
So Crocodile Snap is the pencil grip song, because I used to always call the crocodile fingers. So kind of you have to snap your pencil, or magic fingers or crocodile fingers, but the kids used to like crocodile fingers. So Right Rules actually is my friend. I'm so fortunate. My friend Pat helped me with the music. I did the lyrics, but he did the music for the songs. And he's helped with the handwriting songs as well. So they
cool. So
they're a continuation.
That's good to know then. But because that Crocodile Snap, I had that in my head when I was doing research for this podcast, and I found that, and then it was one of those ones that gets in your head, isn't it?
Yeah.
So before you go, Kim, can you just give us some links of where people need to go, because they'll be wanting to look to find you? So what's your website, your social media, etc.?
Website is just GriffinOT.com. So Griffin spelled like the mythical creature, GRIFFIN. And I'm on Facebook, I'm on LinkedIn, I'm on Twitter. Most of it's GriffinOT. Facebook Sensory, Griffin Sensory OT. There's 2 GriffinOTs on Twitter. I've got the underscore. Adam Griffin's on there as well. So if you're looking for me, I mean, I look very different to Adam. So like, you
people might just spot the difference.
You shouldn't get us confused, because we look very different. But so I am there, and I'm sure you can pop the links at the bottom of the podcast as well. So
well, thanks ever so much, Kim. You've been absolutely brilliant.
No worries.
I loved my chat with Kim. Isn't she great? Do make sure you check out her social media, her website, her videos, her books, everything. And thanks again for listening to Send in the Experts with me, Georgina Durrant. Follow us on social media and use the hashtag Send in the Experts to make sure people know you've been listening. See you again next time.